Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing well. I think we're having a little weather this morning, and
Texas.
We'll make sure that we're not interrupted, like this. But anyway, we will proceed. Found an article that you've also read from TruthDig. It was fascinating because it stated a lot of statistics that we were suspicious of, but they sort of added them up. And that is that we are a nation that drops a lot of bombs.
Yeah.
And now we have an administration that we've expressed our, agreement with, especially when he's looking for less threatening of UN in North Korea, and not threatening that they're going to bomb. And we want that to work. But at the same time, Trump is breaking all kinds of records. First off, he wasn't ever bashful in his campaign or since he's been there. And that is, you got to have a big military, you have to have a big bomb. And one of the first things he did was to drop that non-nuclear gigantic bomb in Afghanistan to show that bombing is a good tool for him. But there has to be a limit to this. Having a defense is one thing, but becoming the chief bomber of history. And this article goes on, and they do a little comparison because we complained an awful lot when we were in Washington about all the needless bombing and warmongering going on under Bush. And then we thought, well, Obama, he's won the Peace Prize, he's going to reduce it. But that didn't happen. And this article is neat because they sort of put it in a context that you can understand. And he came up with a number that Bush was dropping 24 bombs per day, average out, and Obama went up to 34 bombs a day. But our current president, he hasn't won the Peace Prize yet. When you win the Peace Prize, you can increase a little bit. But I don't know, he'll get a super prize or something. But Trump is going 121 bombs per day to protect our liberties, to protect our Constitution, to fight the permanent war, global war on terrorism. At the same time, I think so often this war on terrorism adds up a war against the American people, whether it's the taxation, the inflation, and also the challenge to our civil liberties. But it's ongoing. But I think this monetizes our concern about a foreign policy which is interventionist. A lot of activity there, a lot of money being spent, and quite frankly, I don't believe we're one bit safer. I think we're a lot more endangered.
Yeah, and this piece was done by Lee Camp for TruthDig, which is a good progressive side, I think. But even just in the sheer numbers that he points out, so President Bush, when we actually did have a couple of wars going on, maybe not declared the way they should be, but 70,000 bombs he dropped. Obama, the peace president, 100,000 bombs he dropped in his 8 years. President Trump, 44,000 in his first year. So he's way beyond this. The first thing I thought about after I thought about the death and destruction, of course, think about the cost. How much do these bombs cost? $500,000, $1 million each? This starts adding up to be a little bit of money. What is it producing? Is it producing peace, tranquility elsewhere?
And there's no concern. Of course, we've argued the case that conservatives are not conservative when it comes to spending money. Matter of fact, they get very excited about spending military money because that's their constituency. But this is never held back by the Congress. And it doesn't even get any attention. That was part of the point of the article. Why doesn't anybody talk about this? Because we do have friends in Congress, but it's hard to get anybody to pay attention to what's going on here. But what about the media? Of course, the media is always involved in the issue of war, but they're almost always on the wrong side of it. Yeah. I think a few of them woke up after 60,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Well, maybe this is not a good idea, this sort of thing. But they don't even talk about this. It's sort of hidden, and it's ongoing. And I got to thinking, the big thing in the news for the last year has been what is becoming known as really corruption in the CIA and the FBI and how they were influencing the election. It wasn't the Russians. it was our intelligence gathering group, but they were influencing. I don't have any doubt about that. I don't know whether they'll ever prove that or not. But the CIA and the FBI is involved in this type of activity. We have our special forces overseas. We have the National Security Agency that's very much involved, and we're involved in everything. You know, and if they don't obey, we put on sanctions. Just think how many times you know, the current president has already mentioned about sanctions, and then we have the authority or the power to control the financial markets, deny the ability of some of these countries to even transfer funds, and yet they do this with hardly anybody saying very much about it. Yet, as far as we're concerned, I think this is big news. It needs to be revealed. People need to know what's happening. But a lot of people say, well, if you'd only have the draft, maybe the people would complain a little bit more. But you know, because war is becoming more sterile, a lot of these bombs didn't come from pilots flying over with bombers like in World War II. It's drones and everything. It's very sophisticated, and it's almost a bad thing that they can hide war so often, but eventually it catches up. You mentioned the finances, catch up with finances, or we lose credibility, which we're starting to, or it puts a damage on our dollar. Yeah. Some of those things are going to come, but just the fact that nobody really knows how extreme this is, I think, is important.
And nobody's paying attention to who's being killed, you know, and there's a lot of attention rightly on parents and children being separated. Nobody wants to see that happen here on the border. But and Lee Camp in his piece also reminded us that people on our kill list, people who we're aiming for and targeting, only account for 2% of the drone strike victims. We have a 98% fail rate, and a lot of those are women and children overseas.
And the one thing they don't do is they don't count them.
Yep.
And they say, oh, you can't count them, it's too difficult. You can count them, somebody can count them, and they just don't want to reveal the atrociousness of this type of policy. But you know, it just doesn't happen this way. It is a reflection of perpetual interventionism. And when I think of the international organizations, when I think of United Nations encouraging and we getting our authority to go into Korea, and look how long that has lasted. And then, of course, Vietnam was an international function too. The French were in there. But what about one of the more recent events under Clinton? Under Clinton, you know, when Hillary was under Obama, going into Libya. Now that to me demonstrates how obnoxious our foreign policy is, because I remember very clearly her saying, and we might be able to pull that up, saying, you know, we came, we saw, he died. And that was bad. But I think her giggling over it, that this was a big, neat deal. Yeah. Boy, did we have fun last week. And that, of course, was a NATO fight. You know, we went in there under NATO, and look at the tragedy still going on there. So I think we're going to get that clip.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died. Did it have anything to do with your visit?
And there you have our foreign policy in a nutshell. And unfortunately, a lot of people died. In the same article, 80% of those killed by these U.S. strikes have never been identified. 80% never identified, never talked about. We have no idea who they are.
Right. And in some ways, if there was a more honest rebellion in Libya, and they were fighting for maybe something closer to what the founders of this country fought for, to overthrow a tyrant, and they were victorious, I mean, we shouldn't complain about it, but we don't need to be there. But exactly the opposite occurred. I mean, as bad as Gaddafi was, there was less people dying from it. There was more order. They were actually producing things, and there were jobs. But now, how many factions do you think there are in Libya? You keep up with that pretty well. It's not just like Al-Qaeda is trying to take over the country. I think it's more complex than that.
And ironically, the government that the international community recognizes is a government, because we went in there to give them democracy. It's a government that has not been elected. It's just been appointed by the UN. This is the official government. But you know, Libya is a great point. We talk about bombs dropped. We talk about drone strikes. Libya is kind of a secret war. Nobody wants to talk about it because it's like the ugly stepchild in the closet. but I was reading a piece in The Intercept that pointed out that since 2011, the U.S. has taken 550 drone strikes in Libya. You don't hear about it. That's more than Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan. Hundreds of civilians killed. We are still at war in Libya, still attacking in Libya.
But they don't do that. They don't kill civilians, and it's sometimes called what the collateral damage. But what they do now say frequently is enemy combatant. Enemy combatant. Enemy combatant. Yeah. Well, how do you define enemy combatant? They say anybody that's in our war zone.
Yeah.
And we decide when we're in a war zone, and the world is our war zone because there's so many countries. You know, how many times the different countries, and it might not be a lot of bombs in some countries. It might be, you know, targeting one person. But like you say, that statistic, well, if you look at all the bombs and they are always after a target, 2% of the time they get the guy that they wanted. And of course, he's replaced in 20 minutes, you know, if you're trying to get a leader of some radical group. But that what they'll never entertain, that the radicalization of these countries and these individuals come about because they're taking the moral high ground, that they're defending their homeland. And that doesn't speak for them that they're, you know, wonderful people, but they have the moral high ground because they're the ones who are defending the homeland, and it's a result. It's a consequence of our policy, and then a lot of this unintended consequences or blowback. You know, when they can do something to us, then it sort of qualifies as blowback, and that's why we should be very pleased that at least we're not seeing any problems in our homeland, but I don't think we're immune from it because I think that, especially, you know, with the way immigration's occurring, there could be some people coming in because they still are going to be angry at us, you know, for what we're doing. And I think that, like I've always said, we're not safer, you know, because of our policy.
And you talk about it is just one or two strikes here and there, so people can easily ignore it. But, you know, there's such a dehumanization of foreigners that happens in the U.S. media, in the right and the left, the mainstream right and left in the U.S. Dehumanization of others. Can you imagine, we live in a relatively small town called Lake Jackson. Can you imagine if there was a bad guy somewhere and some country came and dropped a drone on him, even if he didn't have collateral damage? Can you imagine how much we would be up in arms? America, any American in any town should wonder what it would feel like if a foreigner dropped a bomb, even to get a bad guy.
Yeah, I think your analogy is is a good analogy, and I like to use it because when we want to go in and tell the Chinese what they should do in the South China Sea, which could be questionable, but not probably our business, and I say, well, maybe what we should do is, how would we respond, extending what you were pointing out, how would we respond if the Chinese had a lot of activity in the Gulf of Mexico? They wouldn't even have to drop a bomb. We'd be very concerned about or the Persian Gulf. I mean, as far as we're concerned, we own it. You know, and when we show that map of how we have surrounded Iran, we own the area because Iran is surrounded by nukes. But nobody talks about that. We only talk or lie about Iran. Someday might get a nuke, and we don't trust them. And now that they promise not to, and probably aren't working on one, that we have to, you know, give up on that and abandon that effort to work with the Iranians.
And it goes back to money. And, you know, I was reading a piece by Matt Taibbi in Rolling Stone today, and he was talking about the Senate passed the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Bill, earlier this week. Now, this is an appropriate title. For once, I agree with the title of these bills. Patriot Act, all that, no, but this one is good. The John S. McCain National Defense Authorization Act. And the reason it's appropriate, it's an $82 billion increase for 2019. Just that little increase is larger than the entire Russian military budget. Just our little increase.
And that's on top of the one that just occurred late for this particular year that we're in. So where are they going to get the money? And that's a big concern. But where do they get the support, the quiet support? the military-industrial complex obviously is benefiting. There's a lot of profits made. A lot of high union wages are benefited. But if that were the case and they were conspiring against us and they know they weren't protecting our freedoms and protecting our country, they would then say, well, why are they doing this? Who protects them? Why isn't this being investigated? You know, if you investigate it, and release some information, if you were Edward Snowden or Assange, what do you do to him? They become the worst people in the world for telling us the truth about what was going on. You know, and that, of course, was what happened when the truth was revealed about Vietnam. They make the person delivering the message the enemy. And how about the people who revealed about truth or about torture?
Yeah.
They end up.
John Kiriaki.
Kiriaki ended up going to prison. But the people who were disobeying the law and committing this, which quite frankly, my own suspicion is they still do it.
Yeah.
But I don't have any proof of that. But he ended up in prison and nobody gets punished.
They got promotions.
Right. Yeah, there you go.
But you know, the spending on defense, Taibbi mentioned that the spending on defense lobbying has decreased, is from what he's noticed. And he surmises that this is because there's really there's no opposition to military spending anymore, so no need for hiring much more lobbyists. I think that's probably partly true. But I would also say that they're plowing their money elsewhere, and this is something that we talk about a lot. I think they're plowing a lot of their money into think tanks. If you look at how many Atlantic Council, German Marshall Fund, all these places that are rah-rah pro-war, they're all getting funded by the U.S. Defense Department.
No, you've gone over this new bill, the NDAA, but you know, we worked on it, and there's a few people trying to work on it where they don't have these kill lists where you can hold even American citizens indefinitely, but we didn't get any help there, even though there were a few people trying to change that.
Yeah, Senator Paul and I think Senator Lee both were trying to at least get rid of this indefinite detention thing. They were shut down completely.
Yeah, so that means they weren't even allowed to bring it to the floor.
Yeah,
you know, they don't want the exposure. So,
well, I would just say, by reminding Americans, this is not normal. This is not a normal foreign policy. Dropping 44,000 bombs on other countries a year is not normal foreign policy. It would be immoral even if it made the world a better place, even if it made us safer. By killing a bunch of other people is immoral. However, it's doing the opposite. It makes it a far more dangerous place. Nobody can argue that Syria is better after our intervention or that Libya is better after our intervention. So everything is being made worse. And now, again, a plug for our August 18th conference where we're talking about these things. We've just added a couple speakers. I'm going to send out an email to our subscriber list telling you about a couple of the new speakers we have. It's going to be a great gathering, August 18th, Washington, D.C. You do not want to miss it. Dr. Paul?
That is right, and hopefully we have a nice turnout there, and I expect we will. But you know, over the years, I've been known for pressing for an auditing of the Federal Reserve System, believing that if we knew exactly what they're doing behind the scenes and what they do in secret would tell us a lot about what's going on around the world. I have argued that the Federal Reserve is not only involved in bailing out their friends in this country, but it's international banks, international countries, and they were into that big time, you know, after the big recession of 08 and 09. But we didn't get the audit, and we got attention and more people concerned about it, and it's a big issue. But I've also argued that the Federal Reserve is involved in providing funds overseas and elsewhere in foreign policy. And certainly we know the CIA and other organizations have been involved in raising funds, you know, in the drug business. But it's been known now, and I think Truthdig has pointed this out as well, that there's $21 trillion that was on the books that was authorized and spent, and they don't know where it went. But well, look at the audit. Won't the audit tell us? No, they're just like the Federal Reserve. The CIA and the Federal Reserve aren't audited. So there's $21 trillion. And then you have financing coming from drug wars, and you have financing by the Federal Reserve that just gets to create the money of the world, the money accepted by the world. And so it's done in total secrecy. So I think we need government audited. But you know, I'm not even optimistic about that. If they pass a law and said everything is going to be audited, it's too complex. That's why the answer to this is making government less complex. And that means much smaller and obedient to the Constitution, not allowing them to do anything that's not authorized. You know, people complain there's too much money in politics, there's too much money in these elections and too much money in lobbying. But if the government had no power and authority to pass out favors and, you know, manage these illegal wars and do all this mischief, you wouldn't have any incentive to buy politicians. So money is a big deal, and that's why you should deny it to the government and be very stingy. The American people need to be stingy. It's your money, you earned it, you ought to have the right to spend it the way you want. And the government should be very, very limited. The rule is in existence today that you can only do that which has been authorized by the Congress. In Washington, they say that anything that has not been denied by the Constitution, the government's allowed to do it. Oh, the government doesn't prohibit us from doing this, and the president's act on this too. They'll say, well, there's nothing in the Constitution that prohibit us from bombing in Libya. Well, that's messed up. If you have the proper understanding of the Constitution, it's a good step in the right direction of shrinking the size of government. Then the audits would become moot. They would have nothing to audit because they wouldn't be able to take our money. That is certainly a goal that we should strive for. Then we may be moving then in the direction of peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.